My grandfather called it el cobrador, the collector. He chose that word in the summer of 1962. After the first year, he had understood what was coming to the North Pasture and what it expected. In English, the translation is approximate and something is lost in it. A collector is a person who gathers things for the pleasure of gathering them, old stamps or coins or debts that belong to somebody else. My grandfather meant the older usage, the one closer to the creditor who appears when an account falls due. He chose the word deliberately, and he used it only inside the family. And he chose it so he could explain the practice to my father without reaching for a word that would have made my father think he was not serious. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. For 57 years, my family maintained an arrangement that I am only telling you about now because the other two people who knew the full shape of it are both dead. My grandfather Eugenio Vela died in December of 1984. My father Ruben Vela died in December of 2016, exactly 32 years later. My brother Manuel Vela is still living, and if he knew I was telling this account, he would not be pleased. But Manuel lost his standing to weigh in on this subject in the spring of 2019, when he decided that 57 years of unbroken family practice was superstition. He stopped it. We lost 43 animals in 11 weeks. This is not the story of a monster coming to a ranch in South Texas and being survived. It is the story of what my grandfather saw and understood in 1962, what the men who came after him continued for more than half a century because they had a record and a reason, and what happens when the record is dismissed and the reason is not believed. What happened in 2019 was not a surprise to me. It was a confirmation of what the previous 57 years had already established. What surprised me was how fast it moved once the arrangement was broken, and how far it spread once it was no longer contained to a single point on our property. My name is Loretta Vela Peña. I grew up on the Vela family land in the northern section of DeWitt County, about 12 miles north-northwest of Cuero, on a Caliche County road that branches west off U.S. Highway 183 near the Gonzales County line. The full property is 814 acres. My grandfather, Eugenio Vela, filed on the first 500 acres in the summer of 1947, the year he came back from the Pacific with a Purple Heart and enough back pay to put a down payment on ground he had been thinking about since before the war. He had grown up in this county, the son of a man who worked rented pasture on the western end near the Guadalupe bottomland, and he had spent the war years in the Pacific with a specific idea about what he wanted to come back to, a piece of land with his name on it. In the northern part of DeWitt County, where the terrain transitions from the river bottoms in the west toward the sandier upland country east of the highway. He filed on those 500 acres in August of 47 and was on the property working by October of that year, sleeping in a canvas shelter pitched next to the unfinished foundation while he put in fence. He added the North Pasture in 1951 when the Reinhold family sold their back section. The Reinholds had worked that ground since the early part of the century, and they had kept it in adequate condition, the brush management reasonable, and the fencing adequate for the time. My grandfather spent the fall of 51 repairing fence and moving the first of his Spanish doe herd onto the new pasture, and by the spring of 52 the north operation was producing the way he had planned for it. My father, Ruben Vela, added the remaining acreage in 1972 when a small parcel to the south became available. The full 814 acres has not changed hands outside the family since my grandfather's filing in 47, and I intend for it to stay that way. Part of why I am telling this account is that some things need to be on record somewhere other than in a filing cabinet in a house that will eventually pass to people who did not live through the reasoning behind what is in it. The people who can put those things on record while they still have the full shape of them are running out. DeWitt County in the northern section, where this land sits, has a specific character that takes some seasons to understand. The terrain runs from flat, open coastal Bermuda and native grass country east of Highway 183 toward the heavier cedar and live oak country in the draws and low ground as you move west toward the Guadalupe River Valley. The soil east of the highway shifts from the sandy loam of the upland pastures toward the black clay of the drainage areas along the creek systems that feed into the Sandys Creek before it joins the Guadalupe west of the county. The county gets around 31 or 32 inches of rain in a good year, but the distribution is poor for easy agriculture, concentrated in the spring months, and scarce through the dry stretch from July into September that can run 8 or 9 weeks without meaningful precipitation in a bad year. In those stretches, the coastal Bermuda goes dormant, and the stock tanks drop, and the caliche turns to flour dust that billows behind every truck on the county roads and takes the next real rain to settle. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned about dogmen doesn't fit into these videos, so I put it all in a book. It's called the Dogman Codex. If you ever want more, it's linked below. Either way, let's get into the story. The North Pasture is where almost everything I am going to describe took place. The 610-acre block runs north from the Caliche Road through open mixed grass country in the southern half and through rougher, native grass terrain in the northern third, where the land drops and drains toward the Sandys Creek bottomland. The cedar and husake thicket along the creek is dense in places, 40 to 60 meters wide at its widest point before the ground drops to the water. The creek itself is a sandy-bottomed intermittent stream that runs good current after rain and holds scattered pools through a dry summer. After a significant rain, the bottomland on our side can hold standing water for 2 days before it drains. The northeast corner of that North Pasture, where the cedar thicket meets the fence line at the corner post, is the furthest point from the house you can reach on this property and still be within the fence, 650 meters from the barn in a straight line. A mile by the track you have to drive to get there. The cedar thicket provides cover to the fence line at that corner, so something moving through the thicket from the creek side could reach the fence without crossing open ground at any point. When the wind comes out of the north in late fall, you can hear the creek running from that corner on a quiet night. My grandfather chose that corner for the pen he built in the fall of '62, and the more I have thought about it over the years, the more I understand why he chose that specific location rather than any other. My grandfather was 41 years old in 1962 and had been working this land for 15 years. He had a degree in agricultural science from Texas A&M, class of 1940, before the war took him to the Pacific for 4 years. He ran the operation with a methodical record system going back to 1948, the year he had enough going to justify a proper production ledger. The filing cabinet in his office still holds those ledgers, his handwriting for the first 3 decades, and then transitioning to my father's hand in the late 70s as my father took on more of the daily management. My grandfather was not a man who dramatized things, and he was not a man who reached for explanation before he had fully examined what was in front of him. He had spent 4 years in the Pacific in situations where reading the available evidence correctly was the difference between a correct decision and a fatal one, and he brought that way of thinking home and applied it to the ranch the same way he applied it to everything else. Spanish goats, sometimes called brush goats or hill country goats, are the traditional working meat and brush control goat of Central and South Texas. They are not a registered commercial breed in the modern sense. They descend from the animals the Spanish missions brought into Texas starting in the 1700s, and they have been selecting for South Texas conditions on their own for 2.5 centuries, which makes them tougher and more parasite-resistant and more capable of thriving on native browse than any breed developed in a different climate. My grandfather ran about 120 Spanish does on the North Pasture in '62, along with a small number of Boer crossbucks he had started introducing to improve market weight in the kids. In late March of 1962, he found the first dead animal in the northeast corner of the North Pasture. She was a 4-year-old doe, a good producer he had been keeping in the breeding rotation for 3 seasons. He found her at 6 in the morning on his kidding season rounds, on her side in the grass with no visible external trauma. His first thought was lightning, because a storm had come through 2 nights earlier, but the sky had been clear the night before, and the body showed none of the scorching or the rigid muscle lock that a lightning strike death leaves. He had lost 1 animal to lightning the year before, a young buck caught in the open pasture during a July storm, and he knew what that presentation looked like. The skin marked in a linear pattern along the path the current had taken, the muscles locked in a rigid extension that persisted through the cooling, the ground around the animal sometimes discolored from the strike itself. This animal had none of that. He checked her teeth and her eyes. He ran his hand along her spine. He checked her hooves and her legs for any mark that might indicate a fall or a tangle in wire. He checked the fence line within 20 meters in both directions from where she was lying. He walked the surrounding grass in a slow circle, looking for any disturbance in the way the grass lay, any sign of a struggle or a chase or a fall. The search was systematic because he approached everything systematically, and the result was a consistent absence across every category he checked. No external wound of any kind other than what he eventually found at the throat. No sign of struggle in the immediate grass around her, which was undisturbed in the way that grass is undisturbed when an animal does not resist what happens to it. The grass pressed down under her body was in the same pattern you would expect if she had simply lain down and not gotten up. He spent close to 30 minutes with her before he stood and walked back to the barn to make a second pass with his magnification glass, because he did not want to call Dr. Haas out to a death he should have been able to explain himself. He pressed his palm against her side and felt the structure give under his hand in a way it should not have. She was light, not slightly light, not the lightness of an animal that had lost condition over weeks of illness. Wrong in the specific way that something is wrong when the content you expect to find is absent. He rolled her and found 2 wounds in the right side of her neck. They were in the jugular groove below the ear, where the external jugular vein runs close to the skin surface, round, clean-edged, each one roughly 5 millimeters in diameter, placed about 2 centimeters apart. The skin at the margins of each wound was dry and pulled slightly inward toward the openings. There was no blood in the wound channels. There was no blood dried in the hair around the wounds. The ground beneath her was dry caliche and dry grass. He went back to the barn and called Dr. Oscar Haas, who had been his large animal vet since the late 40s and who ran a practice out of Cuero covering most of the northern part of the county. Dr. Haas came out that afternoon with his kit and walked my grandfather to the northeast corner. He worked through his examination in the order he always worked: rigor, body temperature, wound inspection, abdomen, general external condition. He pressed the carcass the way my grandfather had pressed it. He took a rectal temperature and checked the reading twice. He examined the wound site with his magnification loupe and measured the opening diameter and the placement angle. He noted that the core temperature of the animal was 11 degrees Fahrenheit above the ambient ground temperature that afternoon. Standard post-mortem temperature loss in a goat her size proceeds at roughly 1 to 1.5 degrees per hour. The overnight low had been in the mid-50s. For an animal dead since sometime the previous night, the core temperature should have been within a few degrees of ambient. The reading he was holding was 11 degrees high, and he wrote both numbers in his field log and did not offer an explanation for the discrepancy. He examined the wound site with his loupe and measured the angle of penetration. He noted the placement was consistent with simultaneous access to the external jugular vein and the carotid artery from a single entry point. That combination of vessels, accessed at that angle, achieves rapid and complete exsanguination with minimal external blood evidence in a surgical context. He stopped and looked at my grandfather when he said that. In a surgical context, he noted he was not aware of any predator capable of replicating that placement with that precision. He would file with TAHC as cause of death undetermined. The Texas Animal Health Commission form for a livestock death of undetermined cause was a standard document in 1962 used by attending veterinarians when a definitive cause could not be assigned to a commercially significant animal. Its primary function was disease surveillance, designed to catch early signs of reportable illness moving through county herds. For a death classified as non-disease related and mechanically unexplained, the form went to the state office in Austin and was placed in a category that generated follow-up only when numbers in a given county crossed a threshold set by the state epidemiologist. A single undetermined death on a single ranch did not cross that threshold. My grandfather understood this. The TAHC system in 1962 had no mechanism for investigating a death that the attending veterinarian had already ruled non-disease and mechanically unexplained. The form served as a record, nothing more. He appreciated the record, and he appreciated Haas's precision in making it, but he understood from the first filing that the record was going to stay in Austin, and that the investigation, whatever it amounted to, was going to remain on this land. He filed the first TAHC report and came back when the second animal appeared, 11 days later, found in the same northeast corner with the same wound signature, and then a third 2 weeks after that. 3 animals between late March and the end of April, all in the northeast corner, all with bilateral punctures at the throat, all completely exsanguinated, ground dry beneath each one, all with that same quality under the hand, the feel of an animal intact on the outside and largely empty inside. At the examination of the third animal, Dr. Haas said something my grandfather recorded in his composition notebook. He described the wound placement as consistent with what he had just described, simultaneous vascular access at a surgical level of precision, and that he had never encountered this presentation in practice or in his reference literature. He filed the report as undetermined. He would do the same for 2 more animals in May. My grandfather appreciated the honesty and kept Haas's phone number in the front cover of his production book for the next 12 years, until the practice closed in the mid-70s. The losses in '62 came to 6 animals between late March and the middle of May. After mid-May, they stopped. He documented each one in his production book and in a separate, small, spiral-bound composition notebook he kept in his desk drawer, not the filing cabinet. The composition notebook was where he put the observations that a production ledger could not hold. The temperature readings at the time of finding, the ground conditions at each site, the smell, the quality of the wounds under magnification, and the behavior of his dogs on the mornings he found the animals. He kept 2 healers, Rotto and a female called Grizz. On every morning he found a dead animal. Rotto and Grizz were flat on the ground at the barn entrance when he came out, eyes open, unable to get up. They lay that way until mid-morning and were back to normal by afternoon. He wrote this down on each occasion, with the time he came out and the time each dog returned to normal behavior. He also wrote down the smell. He described it as azufre, sulfur, and then added antiseptico. Both together, he wrote, like a chemical room. He had smelled it on the first morning and again on each kill morning after that, strongest within the first hour, fading through the morning until by noon it was gone. He noted that Dr. Haas had not mentioned a smell at any of the examinations. Either Haas had not noticed it or he had chosen not to note it. My grandfather recorded it every time. He went out to the north corner in early June. He had been going out twice a week since mid-May, carrying his flashlight and walking the 650 meters from the barn to the northeast corner fence to check the thicket and come back. On a Saturday night in early June, closer to midnight than to 10, he went out one more time, and this time he found something. He came around the south edge of the cedar thicket to the angle that gave him a sight line on the corner fence, and he stopped. At the corner fence, roughly 25 meters ahead, something was crouched at the base of the cedar post. His hand went to the flashlight switch and stayed there. He estimated, later, about 10 seconds. He was deciding. Then, he turned the light on. It was upright when the light hit it. He had 3 to 4 seconds to see it fully before it moved. He wrote his first entry that same night at the kitchen table, the overhead bulb burning, the handwriting looser than his normal entries, and the pencil pressure uneven. The second entry came the following morning with more light and steadier hands. He returned to the specific observations in order, the way he returned to all field observations. He wrote, "Skin color gray-green in the flashlight beam, not the brown or tawny of any animal he knew in this country, and not the dark of any animal he knew by silhouette." He compared it to wet caliche in shade. The head was oversized relative to the body, wide at the cranium with a narrow jaw. The skull set forward on the neck in a way that gave the upper body a forward lean. The arms were long, reaching well below where a person's hands would hang, and the hands at the ends of those arms were lighter than the rest of the body, almost white in the flashlight. He counted 4 fingers on the nearest hand. Not 5, 4. And the proportions between the joints were wrong for a human hand. The lower segments longer than they should have been. Along the back, las crestas and el lomo, a series of raised structures running from the mid-back toward the lower spine, flat against the body surface when it stood upright in the light, spaced with some regularity. He estimated the height at between 4.5 and 5 feet. He wrote one observation about the eyes that he returned to in the second entry, because it was the one he had not been able to set aside. In 15 years of working this land at night, he had shone that flashlight on every kind of animal active in the county after dark. Every one of them returned some light from the eyes. The tapetal reflection that makes a deer glow at 200 feet, or a coyote's eyes light up green in the headlights, is not variable. It is a physical property of the reflective tissue behind the retina, and it works the same way in every mammal that has it. When the flashlight hit this animal's face directly, the eyes returned nothing. The light reached them and was absorbed. He wrote, "Los ojos no devolvieron nada." The eyes gave back nothing. I held the beam on them for as long as I watched, and there was nothing to see inside them. After 3 or 4 seconds it moved. Sideways, not backward, a lateral step to the edge of the cedar thicket, and then the thicket closed behind it, and the flashlight showed only cedar and shadow. He waited 30 seconds. The smell dissipated in those 30 seconds as if it had been carried on the thing itself rather than left at the location. He walked back to the house. He sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning writing the first entry. His wife, Esperanza, was asleep. He did not wake her. He had not woken her for any of the kill mornings, and he did not wake her for this. She knew about the animal losses because you cannot keep that kind of loss from a person you share a ranch with, and she had accepted his description of the cause as undetermined and the TAHC as involved, both of which were true. She had not asked further, in the way a person stops asking when they sense the explanation being offered is the true one, and also not the complete one. My grandfather had a quality my father described to me once as controlled disclosure. He told people what they needed to know to act correctly, and he held the rest in a separate account. He had maintained that practice with Esperanza through the spring losses, and he maintained it after June of '62. In the 2 weeks following the sighting, he returned to the northeast corner of the north pasture every evening at dusk. He did not take the flashlight on those visits. He stood at the south edge of the cedar thicket and waited for 20 or 30 minutes in the fading light, then walked back to the house. He was not looking for a second encounter. He was learning the location, what the thicket felt like in late evening, what the corner felt like in still air versus wind, what sounds came from the creek when the night animals were active, and what sounds were absent. He noted in the composition book that the quality he had experienced on the night of the sighting was present at the northeast corner on every subsequent evening visit, diminished but consistent, in the way a smell persists in a closed room after its source has been removed. He wrote at the bottom of the second entry, in pencil, underlined twice, "No puedo hacer que se detenga." I cannot make it stop. The question is what it takes and whether providing that separately from the rest keeps the rest safe. That sentence was the reasoning behind 57 years of practice, compressed to 2 lines. He built the corner pen in the fall of '62, cedar posts and welded wire, 10 by 10, a simple gate, and a water trough inside. He told Victorino Reyes, the hired hand who worked for him through most of the '60s, that it was a sick animal holding pen and that the animals placed in it were buried afterward because of contagion risk. Victorino accepted this. My grandfather mentioned nothing further about it to anyone who was not family. Victorino worked for my grandfather for 11 years, from 1960 through 1971, when he moved back to his family's land in Karnes County. He was a reliable hand and a careful observer of livestock, and the kind of man who understood when a question was not going to receive an answer and moved on without pressing it. My grandfather noted in the composition book, in a brief entry from the fall of '62, that Victorino had looked at the corner pen when they were working fence in that area and had accepted the sick animal explanation without visible further curiosity. He added one observation that he returned to in a later entry. Victorino's dogs, 2 large mixed-breed animals that stayed on the property through the working week and had ranged freely across the north pasture without hesitation since my grandfather acquired that ground in '51, stopped going into the north pasture in the fall of '62. They would follow Victorino to the main gate of the north pasture and stop there. They did not go past the gate. Victorino mentioned this once, in passing, as a thing he had noticed and could not account for. My grandfather told him the dogs were getting older and that old dogs sometimes became particular about their range. Victorino accepted this. The dogs never went into the north pasture again. In April of 1963, on the night of the first new moon of the month, he put 2 Spanish goat kids in the corner pen at sundown. He went back to the house. He did not return to the north pasture until 6 the following morning. When he arrived at the corner pen, both kids were dead. 2 puncture wounds each, right side of the neck, complete exsanguination, ground dry. The sulfur smell was already fading as he stood at the gate. He removed both carcasses and buried them north of the cedar line. He wrote the date in the composition book, April 19th, 1963, then 1 line below it, tributo pagado, tribute paid. Then, no losses outside the pen. He lost no other animals in the north pasture that spring. He maintained the practice the following October on the new moon. The same protocol, 2 animals in the pen at sundown and nothing in writing until the following morning, and the morning brought the same result. Animals dead with the same wound presentation, ground dry, no losses outside the pen. He maintained the spring and fall feedings through 64 and 65, and every year after that through 1984, the year he died. The North Pasture herd ran at close to its historical productivity across all of those years. Losses consistent with normal causes. A few animals to coyote predation, some disease mortality, occasional losses to the heat in severe summers. The specific wound signature he had documented 6 times in 62 did not appear in any animal he did not place in that pen. 57 years of practice by 3 men, keeping the same record, and that wound presentation appeared only in the animals the practice provided. He tracked both categories in his production ledger. The animals placed in the pen, listed as a routine operating cost, and the losses in the main herd, tracked the way every rancher tracks mortality. The cost of 2 animals twice a year was less, across the span of years, than the 6 he had lost in the single spring before the practice was established. He never described the practice as a loss. He described it as an operating arrangement with the land. His exact phrase, which I found in the 5th composition notebook in an entry from 1971, was "El trato con la tierra," the deal with the land. The composition notebooks accumulated. He bought them in batches from the feed supply in Cuero, the same 48-page spiral-bound notebooks with green cardboard covers, and by the time he explained the practice to my father, he had filled 5 of them. In 1968, when my father Reuben was 15 years old, my grandfather sat him down at the kitchen table on a Saturday evening in October and put the composition notebooks in front of him. He walked my father through the record from 62 forward. The 6 losses, the 3 TAHC filings, the smell described the same way each time, azufre and antiseptico. The behavior of the dogs on the kill mornings, flat on the ground at the barn entrance, eyes open, unable to get up until mid-morning. He showed my father the June 62 entry, and he read it aloud from the notebook. The gray-green skin, the wrong proportions, the crests along the spine, the eyes that gave back nothing in the flashlight. He showed my father the entries for every spring and fall since 63, each one a single line with the date, the animals placed, and the morning confirmation that no losses had followed. My father told me, 30 years after that conversation, that my grandfather did not ask him what he thought about any of it. He was not presenting it for debate. He was presenting a record that required a reader who would carry it forward. At the end of the 2 hours, my grandfather closed the notebook, put it in the desk drawer, and said, "This is what the North Pasture requires, and this is the practice. And when this land is yours, you will keep the practice because the record tells you to, not because you understand the reason." My father kept the practice for 32 years without asking a single follow-up question about the June 62 entry, about what it meant, or about what would happen if the practice stopped. He did not ask because he had the record, and the record answered those questions plainly. He did what the practice required, twice a year, and he filed his notes in the composition notebooks the same way my grandfather had. By the time my father was managing it on his own, the notebook volumes had grown to 10. My grandfather died of a heart attack in December of 1984, at the kitchen table where he had explained the practice to my father 16 years before. He was 63 years old. The first April my father conducted the practice alone was 1985, and the entry from that morning reads, in my father's handwriting, "1st April without Papa, 2 animals placed, none lost outside the pen. This is the continuation. I'm going to pause here for now." My father ran the North Pasture for 32 years after my grandfather died, and he ran it the way my grandfather had run it, methodically, with records kept current and observations written down without interpretation added to them. He was not a man who speculated out loud about things he could not verify, and he did not speculate about the composition notebooks. He read them as a record of what the land required and what the established response to that requirement was, and he continued the response. He told me once, when I was in my 20s and visiting for a weekend and found him at the kitchen table with the current notebook open, that the most useful thing my grandfather had done was not the observation in June of 62, but the decision he had made afterward. He said, "Your grandfather could have spent the rest of his life trying to understand what he saw at that fence line. Instead, he spent it understanding what the land needed from him in response to what he saw. He said those were different projects, and that the second one was the useful one. He closed the notebook and put it back in the drawer, and we went out to check the evening water. My father had what I would call patient precision. He did not rush conclusions, and he did not fill silence with words when words were not necessary. He held the same place at the kitchen table and the same chair on the porch in the evenings from decade to decade, and the constancy of those positions communicated something about how he understood his relationship to the things around him. He was in the right place for the work, and the work included the composition notebooks and the corner pen and the 2 animals placed twice a year on a schedule that never varied. He no more questioned that schedule than he questioned the annual hay delivery or the seasonal pasture rotation. It was part of what the land required, and he provided it. I want to say one more thing about the corner pen during those quiet decades. The pen was a plain structure, 10 feet by 10 feet, cedar posts weathering gray in the South Texas sun, the welded wire panels replaced once in the 80s when the original wire rusted through. The water trough was galvanized metal, nothing unusual about its appearance if you saw it without knowing what it was for. But it had a quality even in the years between feedings, in the months when it stood empty and the does moved past it on their way to the water, that I noticed every time I was near it. The does noticed it too. They did not approach the corner pen voluntarily. In all the years I walked the north pasture and watched the herd move through it, I never saw a goat enter the pen of its own accord or stand against the corner post nearest the thicket side. They grazed up to about 30 meters from the pen and moved in a direction that kept that distance between them and it. My father noted this in the composition book in the entry from October of 1973. Los chivos no se acercan. The goats do not approach. He had written the same observation in the margin of the April 73 entry as well. The herd understood the corner of the north pasture in a way that my grandfather had understood it, that my father understood it, and that I came to understand it. It was a place set apart from the rest of the pasture. The animals that lived on that pasture treated it that way without being trained to. The year I remember most clearly from the quiet decades was 1979. Because it was the first full year I carried the knowledge of the practice from one side to the other, from the fall feeding through the winter and into the spring one. I was 13. My father had walked me through the composition notebooks the previous October, and by the winter of 78 to 79, I was holding the weight of that record for the first time across the longest gap in the annual calendar. The gap between October and April is 6 months. 6 months of knowing what the corner pen was, and what the northeast corner held, and what the thicket looked like from the inside out. 6 months of walking the north pasture in the normal course of ranch work and being within sight of the pen and feeling what I always felt within 100 meters of it, the specific sharpening of attention that I had not yet learned to manage the way my father managed it. What I learned in that winter, from observation rather than from any direct instruction, was how my father carried it. He carried it as a scheduled item. The April feeding was on the calendar the way the spring hay delivery was on the calendar, the way the brush control burn was on the calendar if the conditions allowed one. It had a date and a requirement and a completion entry, and once the entry was written, it was behind him until the next date came around. He did not dwell. He did not revisit the composition notebook entries between the 2 annual feedings. He managed the record, and the record managed the rest. I began doing the same in the spring of 79, moving the April date to a specific place in my thinking and then putting it away once it was past, and by the following winter the management felt more natural. My father did not comment on this development. He simply ran the practice the way he ran everything else, and expected me to observe and follow, which I did. I was 12 years old the first time my father took me to the corner pen. I had known the pen existed since I was old enough to walk the north pasture, which was probably 5 or 6 years old, and I had known from around age 9 that it served a purpose that was not discussed in front of my mother, or in front of Manuel, or in front of any guest who came to the house. I knew this because I was a child who paid attention to what was spoken carefully, and what was left out. And the corner pen was always left out of any conversation that included anyone outside the immediate family. When I asked my father about it directly, at 9 years old, he told me I was not old enough for the explanation and that I would be told when I was old enough. He said it once and did not offer more. I did not ask again. He took me out in April of 1978, when I was 12. He said we were checking the north corner, which was not unusual, and I walked out with him in the late afternoon light. At the corner pen, he placed 2 young Spanish does inside, checked the water in the trough, pulled the gate closed, and we walked back to the house in the last light without him saying anything about what he had done. He talked about the hay delivery scheduled for the following week, and whether I thought the north pasture needed a second cutting before the summer heat set in. We went inside for dinner. In the morning he went back at 6 and I went with him. Both does were dead in the pen. He said I could see what I needed to see from the gate, and I looked at the ground, which was dry, and at the 2 animals on their sides with their legs slightly extended, and at the wounds on the right side of each neck. He said, "You see the wounds?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The ground." I said, "No blood." He said, "Now you know what it looks like, and you will recognize it if you ever need to." He pulled on his work gloves and began removing the carcasses, and I walked back to the house. He explained the composition notebooks to me that fall after the October feeding. He sat me down the same way my grandfather had sat him down, with the notebooks open on the table, and walked me through the record from 62 forward. By 1978, the record was 16 years long. He showed me the June 62 entry and he read it to me in my grandfather's handwriting, the description of what the flashlight had shown at the fence line that night. He did not add to the description or comment on it. He read it aloud and closed the notebook. He said my grandfather had not gone back out at night to the north corner after June of 62, and that this was the right decision. He told me where the notebooks were kept, and he told me that if anything ever happened to him before Manuel or I were ready, the continuation of the practice was my responsibility, not Manuel's. When I asked him why not Manuel, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said Manuel had the kind of mind that turned a record into a story. He said a record is only useful if you treat it as a record, and that Manuel heard the explanation, and what he retained was the structure of it, the idea of a deal made with a creature on the land, rather than the evidence behind the deal and the reasons the deal had held. He said the reasons were what mattered, not the story. Manuel was 14 in 1978. He was the firstborn son and he was being prepared, the way firstborn sons on working ranches in South Texas are prepared, for the full weight of the operation. My father loved Manuel without reservation. He also knew, by the time I was 12 and Manuel was 14, which of his children had the kind of careful attention that the composition notebooks required. I left this land at 18 to go to Texas A&M, the same institution my grandfather had attended before the war. I studied range science and graduated in 1986. I came back to the ranch for summers and every holiday through my 20s. I was home for Christmas in 1984 when my grandfather died of that heart attack at the kitchen table, and I went through his things with my mother in the weeks after and found the original green-covered composition notebook in the top drawer of the desk, exactly where my father had always said it was. I married Eloy Pena in 1989. Eloy grew up in Gonzales County and had worked livestock since he was a boy. He came to this ranch understanding what ranch work looked like from the inside, and in the first year of our marriage I showed him the composition notebooks. I walked him through the record the same way my father had walked me through it, and I showed him the June 62 entry and let him read it himself. He sat with it for a while, and then he put the notebook down and asked what we would do if the practice was interrupted for a season. I said I did not know for certain, but that the record suggested the answer. He said, "Your father knows." I said, "Yes." He did not ask me to stop the practice or to explain more than I had already explained. He was that kind of man. He understood that some records speak for themselves and that adding interpretation to them does not make them clearer. The first time I managed the April feeding entirely without my father involved was 1993. He was still on the property and in good health, but he was 67 that year, and the walk to the northeast corner had become a distance that required more from him than it once had. In March, he asked whether I felt ready to run it without him. I told him I was. He gave me a single instruction: go in the afternoon, come back in the morning at first light. Do not go out between. I drove the North Road on the afternoon of April 23rd in my pickup, 2 young Spanish does in the bed, animals I had kept separate at the barn pen for a week. The drive to the northeast corner is about 3/4 of a mile on the caliche track. I have made that drive so many times since that I cannot always separate one from another in memory. The 93 drive I remember because of what was in the air when I stepped out of the truck at the corner pen. The sulfur and antiseptic smell was present in the late afternoon, hours before I placed the animals. I had never encountered that smell outside of the early morning windows around the kills. I stood beside the truck with my hand on the gate latch, and I identified the smell, and I took inventory of what I was feeling, which was a flat, specific alertness. And then I went on. I placed the does in the pen, checked the trough, latched the gate. I drove back to the house in the last light. My father was at the kitchen table with the current composition notebook open in front of him. I told him the animals were placed and that the smell had been present in the late afternoon when I arrived. He looked at the table for a moment without responding. Then he wrote something brief in the margin of the open page, 2 or 3 words in pencil, and closed the notebook. He did not explain what he had written, and I did not ask. We ate dinner, and I went home. In the morning, both does were dead. I removed the carcasses and wrote the entry in the notebook. That was the year I began keeping my own backup animals at the East Barn. 1 or 2 animals maintained year-round for the practice, in case something interfered with the timing on the north pasture side. We built our own house on the east side of the main pasture in 1991, close enough to the main barn to be useful. My parents still lived in my grandfather's house, which my father had expanded in the 80s. My father managed the north pasture operation and I managed the cattle side on the south and east pastures, with Eloy handling the equipment and the fencing and the heavier field work. The arrangement worked because we were all methodical and because we had grown up with the same basic understanding of what working land requires. I want to tell you what the decades of the practice felt like from inside them, because I think it is easy to hear what I am describing and to picture a family living under a threat, on edge every season, watching for what might come. It was not like that, or not exactly. The practice was built into the rhythm of the ranch the same way any piece of necessary work is built in. The way you budget for fence repair in a wet year or for drought supplementation in a dry one. The spring feeding was a cost, and it was a known cost, and because it was known, it was not frightening in the way that unknown costs are frightening. My grandfather had replaced uncertainty with a protocol. Protocols are manageable even when what they are managing is strange. There is a specific kind of steadiness that comes from having a procedure for something, even when the something is outside ordinary experience, and that steadiness was present in my grandfather's production records, and in my father's, and in my own. The practice was written into the operating calendar the same way every other seasonal task was written in. It had its date, and its requirements, and its morning confirmation entry, and then it was done for another season. What remained difficult, and I will be honest about this, was the location. The northeast corner of the north pasture maintained a quality that I can only describe as heightened attention. A specific sharpening that happened to me every time I was within 100 meters of the corner pen, regardless of the time of year and regardless of whether the pen was in use. The cedar thicket at that corner was visually different from the cedar elsewhere on the property. Denser, more interior feeling, the kind of density that makes the space inside it visible as darkness even in full daylight. I walked that fence line in every season for 30-plus years, and the northeast corner was always the part where I shortened my time without consciously deciding to shorten it. My back went to the thicket less at that corner than anywhere else on the property. My grandfather had built the pen as close to that thicket as the fence line allowed, and I think he did that because he had understood, from his June '62 observation, that the cedar thicket was the point from which whatever used the pen approached it. The pen met the circuit at the place where the circuit naturally came to the fence. If you know someone whose family has maintained a specific practice around their livestock for more than one generation, a practice that was explained as a necessity rather than a tradition, I want to hear about it. It does not have to be in South Texas. It does not have to be about goats or cattle. What I am asking about is the specific shape of a family protocol built around something on the land that required a regular response, passed from one generation to the next without being fully explained, and what happened when the chain of transmission broke. If you have seen this or heard about it from someone you trust, put it in the comments. This account has been in my family for 62 years, and I want to know who else has been carrying something like it. My father ran the north pasture operation until he was 72, when his back gave out badly enough that he had to reduce his field work. He transferred primary herd management to Manuel and to a hired hand named Domingo, who had been with us since 2003. He kept his direct management of the corner pen feeding until he was 75, which was 2011. After that, he supervised from the truck cab, and Manuel's son Ricky did the physical work in the north pasture under my father's direction. My father had a stroke in the summer of 2015 that took most of the mobility from his right side and reduced his speech. He spent his last 18 months in the house with my mother and rotating family care. He could not walk to the north pasture. He could not drive. Manuel and I managed the operation between us. The spring of 2016, the April feeding, was the first time in 53 years that someone other than my grandfather or my father placed the animals in the corner pen. Manuel did it. Because Manuel was managing the north pasture by then. I told him what to use, how many, and which night, and he followed the instructions. My father, when I told him the following morning, made a sound with his right hand on the arm of his chair that I understood as acknowledgement. My father died in December of 2016, 3 weeks after his 81st birthday. In the weeks after the funeral, I sat with Manuel at the kitchen table, the same table our grandfather and our father had used for this specific conversation, and I put the composition notebooks on the table in front of him. Manuel knew they existed. He had been told about the practice years before, at 17, I believe, sitting at the same table. He picked up the original green notebook and looked at the cover and set it down without opening it. He said he had continued the practice since our father could no longer do it himself, and he would continue what the practice required. He said it in the tone you use for something that is a duty rather than a question. I said I wanted him to read the June 62 entry specifically. He looked at me and then at the notebook. He did not open it. He said he had read it before and that he understood what our grandfather had written and what it meant. I said, "Then you understand why the practice has to be exact." He said he understood. He said he did not need to have this conversation every time the subject came up. I said there was nothing more I needed to say right then. He maintained the practice through the fall of 2017 and the spring of 2018 and the fall of 2018. His entries in the notebooks were consistent with his usual record-keeping style. The date, the animals placed, the morning condition, a single-line confirmation. He had his own rhythm, and I did not supervise it. I was at my house on the east side managing the cattle operation, going over to the main house for family dinners and for the quarterly production reviews. Manuel and I ran together. At the production review in January of 2019, Manuel told me he had been thinking about the corner pen. I want to give him the fairest account I can of what he said, because what he said was not unreasonable on its surface. He had been running the numbers on the north pasture goat operation, and the cost of 2 animals twice a year had grown more significant than it had been in my grandfather's time, because Manuel had moved from Spanish does to Boer crosses over the preceding decade, commercial animals with higher per head value than the brush goats my grandfather had run. He had been doing this calculation for 2 years. He mentioned he had also been looking at what our grandfather had documented in '62, and that after rereading the entry, he was not certain the description was inconsistent with a misidentification, something misread in poor light, by a man who had already lost 6 animals and was understandably looking for an explanation. I will not tell you everything I told him in that conversation because some of it was not productive. What I will tell you is what I told him directly, that the record established a specific relationship between the practice being maintained and no anomalous losses occurring, and that the record was 56 years long at that point, and that 56 years was a baseline that should not be discarded on the basis of a rereading of my grandfather's description through a preferred alternative explanation. My grandfather was an A&M-trained agricultural scientist who had spent 4 years in the Pacific and who had kept the most thorough production records in this county for 30 years. His specific observations in the June '62 entry were not descriptions that came from a misidentification. He described what he saw in the same sequenced and detailed way he described everything he observed in the field, and the sequence was internally consistent and specific in ways that a misidentification would not produce. Manuel said he heard me. He said he was going to make a decision about the spring and he would tell me what it was. He told me in March he was not going to put animals in the corner pen in April of 2019. The decision was made and it was not going to change. I went back to my house and I called Eloy and I told him what Manuel had decided. Eloy was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Do you want to go over his head?" I said I could not. The operation was his to run. Manuel had inherited the north pasture management with the property, and I had no authority over his decisions on it. Eloy said, "Then we watch." I said, "Yes." The first loss came in June of 2019. I want you to understand the timing, because the timing matters. From March through mid-May of '62, before my grandfather established the practice, the losses had come in spring. In every year from '63 through 2018, the practice was maintained in April, and no losses occurred outside the pen. In 2019, the practice was not maintained, and the first loss arrived in June, not in April or May. I have thought about this since, and my reading of it is this. The pattern of losses in the natural cycle was not tied to April specifically because of anything the season produced. It was tied to April because that was when my grandfather had established the first feeding, and whatever circuit used the pen had organized around that date across 56 years of repetition. In a year when the practice was not maintained, the circuit arrived and found the pen empty and moved on to the herd. The arrival was later than the historic killing pattern because the circuit gave the date some time before recognizing the arrangement had lapsed. Manuel called me on a Tuesday morning in mid-June. He said he had found a doe in the north pasture. He described the wounds without my asking. He said there was no blood under her. I asked what the ground looked like under the carcass. He was quiet for a moment and then said the ground was dry. I asked if he had smelled anything when he walked up to her. He said maybe. Like matches, he said. I said I would come over. When I arrived at the north pasture, he was standing beside the carcass, which was in the northwest quadrant of the pasture, not at the northeast corner where all of my grandfather's losses and my father's records had been concentrated. I pressed my hand against the animal's side. The structure gave the way it had always given when I had felt it before, the way I had felt it as a 12-year-old girl standing at the gate of the corner pen looking at two does laid out in the morning grass. The specific compliance of a container that has been emptied of what it was built to hold. I said to Manuel, "This is what the practice was preventing." He said he was aware of that. I said, "We need to restart it, put 2 animals in the pen on the new moon." He said he would think about it. In those 4 days between when I told him to restart the practice and when he called the vet, he did 3 things. He called Cord Reinert at the county extension office in Cuero, a man who had been in that position for 12 years and who knew the northern part of the county well. Cord had no explanation for the wound presentation beyond what Dr. Garza had already put in her notes. He mentioned a wildlife specialist out of the Victoria district who had been documenting unusual predation losses in the coastal Bend counties and suggested that Manuel reach out to that office if the losses continued. Manuel wrote the number down. He also called our cousin Rafael, who ranches in Uvalde County and had dealt with significant mountain lion depredation in 2015 during the drought years. Rafael's losses had been confirmed by a TPWD depredation investigation. The wound signature was nothing like what Manuel was finding, and Rafael had no frame of reference for the description Manuel gave him. But Manuel had called him anyway, because Manuel built pictures by consulting people he trusted and triangulating across what they told him. What he did not do was open the composition notebooks. I know this because I asked him directly, in the week after the first loss, whether he had read the June '62 entry recently. He had not read it since before our father's stroke. I asked what he remembered from it. He was quiet for a while and described the general shape of the entry. Gray skin, wrong proportions, the spine structures, the eyes. He remembered the outline. What he did not mention was the specific observation about the eyes returning no light in the flashlight beam. That detail is the one that my grandfather returned to in the second entry specifically because it was the one he could not set aside. It is a physical property, not an inference, and my grandfather had written it in physical terms. The absence of tapatala reflection in the light beam is not a detail a misidentification produces, because it is not a matter of interpretation. Manuel had read that entry, and what he retained was the structure of the event, not the specific observations that gave the structure its weight. My father had been right about the kind of mind Manuel had. He called the vet instead. Dr. Reina Garza had taken over when the previous practice closed in 2012, a thorough and direct woman who had been covering the northern part of the county for the past 7 years. She came out and examined the animal and wrote in her notes what every vet who had ever looked at these wounds on this property had written: exsanguination, mechanism, undetermined. She filed with TAHC. My father had filed that form at least a dozen times over 32 years. The form accomplished nothing in any of those cases, and it accomplished nothing here. The second loss came 4 days later. Same north pasture, different location, same presentation. The third came in early July. Manuel did not call me that time, and I heard about it at our next production meeting. By that point, he had found 5 animals in the north pasture over 6 weeks, all with the same wound signature, all with dry ground underneath, all with the same feel under the hand when you pressed them. He called me in early July to say he was going to put animals in the corner pen on the next new moon. I said, "I'll be there." We drove out together on a Thursday afternoon in his truck, the bed carrying 2 young Boer bucks he had pulled from the herd. We drove the north road to the northeast corner and backed up to the gate of the corner pen. The gate was stiff at the hinges from the spring rains, and we worked it open between us. We put both bucks in the pen and checked the trough, and I latched the gate. Standing at that gate in the late afternoon, with the cedar thicket 10 meters past the north fence and the north pasture opening behind us, I felt what I had always felt at that corner. That specific sharpening of attention, the quality of a place that requires more of you than the surrounding pasture does. Manuel stood at the gate beside me, and I noticed he was facing the open pasture rather than the thicket. His back was to the north fence, the position you naturally take when you are managing the sensation by not looking directly at its source. I had stood in the same position 100 times. I said, "Have you smelled anything out here before the losses started?" He thought for a moment and said, "Twice in the early morning, before I found anything dead." I said, "Where?" He said the northeast corner both times, near the pen. I looked at the cedar thicket north of the fence. Dense in there, dark at the interior, the way it had always been. I have spent 62 years looking at that thicket from this side of the fence, and I have not gone into it past the first meter. There is no reason to go into it, and there has never been one. We drove back to the house without talking much. I came back in the morning at 6. Both bucks were dead. The wounds were where they always were, the same side of the neck, the same position, the same clean margins. The ground was dry. The smell was present as I walked up to the gate and fading as I stood there. I took off my hat and stood at the gate for a while, and then I put the hat back on and went to work. Manuel found no additional losses in the north pasture after that July feeding. That fall, in October, Manuel's truck was out of service, with an engine problem the week the feeding was due. I drove up with 2 Spanish does I had been keeping at my place specifically for this purpose, animals I had maintained as a backup without telling Manuel. I put them in the pen and came back in the morning and did what needed doing and wrote the entry in the notebook. Manuel saw the entry at the next review and did not ask where the animals had come from. But I need to tell you what else happened in the summer of 2019 that I have not mentioned yet. The losses in the north pasture after the practice lapsed in 2019 did not stay inside our fence line. Manuel had found 5 animals on our property between mid-June and early July. What I did not know until December of that year, when Manuel told me at the family Christmas dinner with more of the story than I expected from him, was that 2 of our neighboring properties had also experienced losses in that same period. Doug Halbert ranches about 1,200 acres on our east boundary. He and his family have been on that ground since his father bought in the late 1960s. Doug is in his mid-60s, a steady and methodical man, the kind of rancher who notices what the land is doing because he has been paying attention to it for 40 years. In July and August of 2019, Doug lost 7 goats on the side of his property nearest our north pasture fence. He had not had unexplained losses in that pattern before. He called the county extension office and the county depredation control program, and a wildlife services trapper came out and set traps in the area of the losses. The traps did not catch anything. The losses stopped in August and did not recur in the fall. The Kirchner family ranches the ground to our north, past the cedar country, where their property shares a corner with the far end of our north pasture near the creek. Marjorie Kirchner is in her mid-70s and has been on that land since her marriage in 1967, which means she has been watching it longer than almost anyone in the northern part of this county. She is not someone who misreads livestock losses. In August of 2019, she began losing calves, 2 in August and 2 in September. And when Manuel spoke to her in late September, she described the wound signature without any prompting from him. 2 small round holes on the right side of the neck, below the ear, no blood on the ground. She said she had smelled something chemical and sulfurous near the first calf when she found it in the morning, in the area of her south fence nearest our cedar country. She said the smell was gone by the time her husband came out to look. Marjorie Kirchner had been on that land for 52 years. She did not know about our composition notebooks. She did not know about the corner pen or the practice, or what my grandfather had established in 1962. What she described to Manuel was what the records in our notebooks had described 37 times over 57 years. The wound profile, the absence of blood, the chemical smell at the site. She had arrived at the same description independently, from the same evidence, without any prior knowledge of our records. I want to be careful about what I am and am not claiming here. I am not claiming that what Marjorie Kirchner experienced in 2019 was identical in origin to what my grandfather documented in 62, because I do not know that with certainty. What I am claiming is that the wound signature she described to Manuel in late September of 2019 matched the wound signature in our composition notebooks. In every detail she had the information to observe: the location of the wounds, the round, clean-edged profile, the absence of blood at the site, the chemical sulfurous smell on the morning of the first loss. The details she volunteered without prompting were the details that had appeared in our records across 57 years. The Kirchner property borders ours to the north, through the cedar country and across the fence line that separates the far end of our north pasture from her pasture south of the creek. If the circuit my grandfather had documented moved through the northern section of this county on a rotation that included our property, it would not require any unusual logic to conclude that the properties adjacent to ours were within the same rotation. This is the part I have sat with most often when I think about what the practice contained for all those decades and what happened when it was suspended. The arrangement my grandfather had built in 63 was not simply protecting our north pasture herd from losses. It was providing a specific point in the landscape that concentrated the demand in one location and on a schedule. The corner pen was a known address on the circuit. When that address was removed from the circuit without replacement in the spring of 2019, the demand did not disappear. It spread across the surrounding properties in a radius that covered the adjacent fence lines. The Halbert losses were east of our north boundary. The Kirchner losses were north, through our cedar country. Both were properties that had not experienced this wound signature before 2019. Both experienced it in the summer and fall of 2019, and not before and not after, as far as I know. My grandfather had not understood the practice as solely protecting his own herd. He had called it el trato con la tierra, the deal with the land. And the land in that phrase was not just his 800 acres. Whatever circuit moved through the northern part of this county had been moving through it for longer than any of our family had been here, and the corner pen had been a point of accommodation on that circuit for 57 years, providing a predictable stop that kept the circuit organized and contained. When the stop was removed, the circuit did not end, it expanded. I have spent time since 2019 trying to understand how large the circuit is, which is not a question the composition notebooks answer because my grandfather had data only from inside our fence line, and he did not speculate past his data. The Kirchner property is about 1.25 miles north of our corner pen as the ground runs through the cedar thicket and across the Sandys Creek and into the upland country on the north side. The Halbert property is closer, their west fence meeting the east side of our north pasture boundary at roughly the halfway point of that line. If you drew a circle centered on our corner pen with a radius of about 2 miles, you would take in both properties and several others in the northern section whose 2019 loss history I do not know, because I did not contact them, and I had no way to contact them without explaining why I was asking. I considered it. I decided against it, for the same reason my grandfather had described in 62. The description you would need to provide to make the question intelligible is specific enough that the people you are asking would be left wondering whether you were in some way responsible for what they had lost. What I can say is that the circuit, whatever its radius, was organized around our corner pen across 57 years of the practice. The pen was the fixed point. The rest of the circuit moved on its own schedule through the surrounding land, and the fixed point absorbed the demand at a predictable location twice a year. My grandfather had not created the circuit. He had identified a point on it and made that point useful. When the point was removed, the circuit did not reorient itself toward a new fixed point. It expanded outward from the location of the former fixed point in the pattern of any system that has lost its organizing node. I restarted the practice in April of 2020. I told Manuel what I was doing, and he said to do what I thought was right. I drove the north road at 4 p.m. and put 2 young Spanish does in the pen and closed the gate and drove back to the main house. In the morning, both animals were dead, and the ground was dry, and the smell was present as I walked up and fading as I stood there. I removed the carcasses and buried them north of the cedar line, the same place my grandfather had buried his first offering in '63, in ground that had received every subsequent burial across 57 years of practice, and that was dark and deep in that spot from all of them. We lost no animals in the north pasture in the spring of 2020. I do not know what the Kirchner losses were in the spring of 2020, and I did not ask Marjorie directly. The information that might connect those facts for her is in our composition notebooks, and the notebooks are not something I have shared outside the family. In March of 2021, Manuel called me before I had arranged the April feeding. He said he had been at the corner pen in late February to repair a section of fence that a cedar branch had damaged in the winter ice storm, and that while he was working on the fence in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, he had smelled the chemical smell in the area of the cedar thicket on the north side of the fence. Not at dawn, when he might have been near the morning trace of the previous night's activity. In the middle of the afternoon, he said the smell lasted about 4 minutes, and then it was gone, and he had stood at the fence for the remainder of those 4 minutes because he was not going to let himself walk back to the truck while it was still present. He said he wanted to tell me that. I said, "That tells you it's on a schedule, and the schedule has resumed." He said, "I know." He did the April feeding himself in 2021 and has maintained the practice since. We do not have long conversations about it. He goes out on the new moon in April and the new moon in October, and he puts the animals in the pen and writes the entry in the morning. He has not lost anything outside the pen in the north pasture since July of 2019. 5 years without an anomalous loss in the north pasture. That is the same accumulation my grandfather built across 21 years of maintaining the practice before he explained it to my father, and that my father accumulated across 32 years after that. The record has a shape, and the shape is clear, and it has been clear since 1963. The composition notebooks are now 6 volumes. My grandfather's original 3, and the 3 my father started, continued in my own handwriting during the years I managed the practice, and then in Manuel's handwriting from 2016 forward. The entries in the earliest volumes are in pencil, faded in places, the green cardboard cover of the first notebook, water-stained and soft at the corners from 60-plus years in a desk drawer. The entries in the most recent volume are in black gel pen in Manuel's handwriting, neat and consistent. A line or two per feeding with the date and the number of animals and the morning condition. The June 1962 entry is on page 31 of the first volume. My grandfather's handwriting in that entry is looser than his normal working handwriting, the letters slightly larger than in the production records he kept in the filing cabinet, the pencil pressure uneven in the way that pencil pressure is uneven when hands are not fully steady. The observation at the bottom of the second entry, the one he wrote the morning after, is in his normal, careful hand, "No puedo hacer que se detenga." I cannot make it stop. The question is what it takes, and whether providing that separately keeps the rest safe. His answer to that question held for 57 years, and resumed when it was interrupted. That is the record. I have been asked, by the one person I told this account to before now, whether I resent the practice. The question came from a woman I sat next to at an agricultural extension meeting in Cuero in 2022, a rancher from the Shiner area, who had managed her family's ground for 30 years, and who had a quality of attention in conversation that made me say more than I had intended to about our north pasture operation. I gave her a partial account, enough to describe the shape of it without all of the details, and she asked directly, "Do you resent it?" The honest answer is that I do not, and I have thought about that answer enough to trust it. What I feel about the practice is closer to what my father described to me in that conversation about the 2 projects my grandfather could have chosen after June of '62. The project of understanding what he had seen, or the project of understanding what the land needed from him in response to it. My grandfather chose the second project, and the record across 57 years supports that choice in every entry. A practice that returns the same result every time it is followed, across more than half a century and 3 different people maintaining it, is not a superstition. It is a protocol with a demonstrated outcome. I was raised on a working ranch in South Texas where precision and record-keeping and scheduled maintenance are the description of competent operation, and the practice has always fit inside that description for me. What I do carry, and have not found a way to set down, is what the 2019 interruption cost the Halbert and Kirchner families. They were not party to Manuel's decision and had no way to anticipate what it meant for their herds. Doug Halbert lost 7 goats in July and August of 2019. Marjorie Kirchner lost 4 calves in August and September. Neither of them knew why, and the Wildlife Services trapper and the TAHC filings produced nothing that explained it to them. The information in our composition notebooks would have been relevant to their losses in a way I cannot reasonably deny. I did not share it. I am not certain I made the correct decision in not sharing it, and I am not certain what the correct decision would have looked like in practice. My grandfather is buried in the cemetery behind the Catholic Church in Cuero, 7 miles from this land. The headstone has his name and his dates, and a phrase my grandmother chose, fiel a la tierra, faithful to the land. She chose it because she had lived on this ranch for 37 years, and she knew what his work had been, and she chose a phrase that covered everything it needed to cover without specifying what any of it meant. I think about that phrase when I am in the north pasture in the spring, doing the walk my grandfather did for 21 years before my father did it for 32. The land is the same land. The cedar thicket at the north fence is the same cedar thicket. Whatever moves through that thicket on its circuit through this part of the county has been moving through it since at least 1962, and likely longer than that. My grandfather did not invent the arrangement. He identified it and documented it and built a practice around the evidence of what the records showed. That is a different thing from controlling what he had identified. He never used the word control. The filing cabinet in the office holds the composition notebooks on the left side and the production ledgers on the right, the way it has held them since my grandfather organized it in the 1960s. The production ledgers are for what the ranch produces. The composition notebooks are for what the ranch requires. My grandfather understood both categories clearly and kept both in the same cabinet, which tells you something about how he understood their relationship to each other. Both were records of what was real. Both required the same precision. Both had to be passed down with the same care. I do not use the word control either.